Now this right here is meant to be my new AGP graphics card that I've ordered from China. These have been popping up quite a bit. I think they've already been covered a little bit before on YouTube, but I've not covered them myself, and you know, the fact they're making brand new AGP cards is just something fascinating. I think these are about 25 quid, and they are also doing these as PCI variants, which we'll talk a little bit more later. And this just arrived a little while ago actually. I've been meaning to get around to this for quite some time, and you know, it just arrived along with a load of other stuff I'd ordered from China and came in a complete bundle like this, and seems alright. I mean, I'm going to show you something else real quick. I've just had a Pentium 4 setup arrive, wrapped in Asda wrapping paper. This thing managed to get across the entire ocean better than a Pentium 4 motherboard from 30 miles away. But more than anything, we want to see what you actually get and if this is actually worth doing, because AGP cards are getting expensive now. They are certainly getting up in price. So if you can order them brand new, in working condition, it makes more sense to go out and get one like this. I mean, I've got a graphics card on the way, which is a Matrox Millennium Series 1, but even then I had to wait about 4 or 5 months for one of these to pop up on eBay. This was just a case of clicking buy it now, and it showed up a week later. So let's see what you actually get. It's very well packaged. I might just sort of cut my way into this one. Well, that worked. So what have we actually got inside? We have got nothing else in the box. We've got some bubble wrap. There is our actually Nvidia branded AGP graphics card. Perfect Capabilities graphics card. So I'm guessing the brand making these is called Perfect Capabilities, but it checks out. I think this is meant to be an FX5500, which is not a spectacularly great graphics card from the era, but was, you know, a mid-range card. We've not really looked at much of the FX series. Maybe we'll touch on some history, but we'll double check it works first, and then if we do touch on any history, it certainly is a new chapter in the FX5500's book that they are now the easiest AGP graphics card to get a hold of, brand new. So I have got a bit more information on how these are being thrown together, and we'll touch more on that later, but let's plug this in and find out, does this actually even work? Because if it does, that's remarkably good value. So what we can do is we can just plug this into the normal Budget Builds AGP test system. So let's see, does it actually turn on? Yep, immediately, FX5500. That was nice to see. There we go, booting to Windows XP. Now, you don't get any drivers with this, so we will have to go through and download some drivers. In a complete change from what I was expecting, Nvidia does actually support the FX5500 on their website. So you can just go straight here and download the latest drivers, which are dated 2008. So we'll give these ones a go. I know there's probably better ones than this to use, but we'll just use these ones for now because they're the ones that Nvidia lists on their website still, which is actually quite nice to see from Nvidia. So we should now have some drivers on this USB stick, which should hopefully work. 11 days left for activation, we'll just ignore that. Now anyone that's really into their AGP cards will be down in the comments telling me this is not the best version to use, but let's be honest, the average person that's going to be buying a brand new AGP card off AliExpress is going to be downloading the first drivers they see that say Windows 2000/Windows XP. So that's all they're going to be doing. You know what? Generally the Nvidia drivers for older cards tend to be pretty decent. You know, there's not really much to go wrong with them, and we're currently installing, so we should soon have actual display drivers. I don't even know if we've got any basic benchmarks on here for me to load up and test. We'll have something. We've got games. We can always just test a game real quick and see what it does. And then while we install some newer benchmarks, maybe we can learn a little bit more about the history of the FX5500 now that it's got a new stage of its history. I wasn't really planning on much of a history video when we went into this one, but I suppose there's a story behind how these have got made. There's a story of how we've got here. No information on shaders or anything like that at all. Run 3D Mark. Do something. Give us some graphical acceleration. It's a rather intensive benchmark, this. Is the card getting warm? A little bit. Yeah, performance is about where it should be, I think, for an FX5500. I know very little about these cards. I've had no experience with the FX5500. The card's silent. Mostly what you can hear is the hard drive in that computer, which I've probably edited out in post. So yeah, let's crack on with the rest of the video. So Nvidia's FX5500, just what is this graphics card? Well, it's a bit of a hard one to explain because it isn't really a unique graphics card. This is actually an FX5200. All Nvidia did was back in 2004 was take the FX5200, a rather hateful graphics card, and decide that, you know what, we're going to re-release it. But what they did do was standardize the range. See, these things actually got better memory, usually about 256 megabytes on the better models, and they mostly all came with a 128-bit memory bus. So, they did standardize things a little bit. Reviews at the time were not very positive, let's just put it this way. The same as the rest of the FX range, there was no real reason to buy one, so these didn't sell. And when they did sell, people were sorely disappointed because they didn't run many things. They have the same caveats. They can't run DirectX 9 very well. They can't run very much very well. But what Nvidia did manage to do was at least boost the brand name. So a lot of people thought they were getting an even better graphics card than their FX5200, and for some people, it actually performed worse. For some people better, it was just a bit of a standardization of the range. The weird thing is that they're being re-released. But the thing is, why? Well, I've done a little bit of digging, I've contacted the manufacturers of these, and it seems like what's happening is all of those chips that either didn't sell or ended up in salvage, all of those broken ones, whether they're an FX5200 or an actual FX5500 like this, they just got scrapped. And they took the chips from them, they put them on a PCB with a better memory bus and 256 megabytes of RAM, they flash the BIOS and they all say FX5500, and it's a bit of a potluck. See, I've seen reviews of these saying they didn't work, I've had reviews saying theirs came with 150 megahertz core clocks and things like this. This one comes with 250, which makes this a very low-end version of this card. In fact, it makes it more or less an FX5200 exactly. So you can see, it's the same confusion that was happening back in 2004 is now going to be happening today with these coming from AliExpress. But what they are is cheap, and what they do is mostly work, at least by this point in 2025. I think these have been on the market for 5 years or so now. So what we'll do is we'll do a little bit of testing and we'll find out if this is even worth your time. Personally, at the moment, it's a little bit like that, because they weren't a great card, and they're not exactly going to be a great card today, but what they are is available. So we're now looking at the FX5500 in its next era. It started off as a standardization of a very hateful graphics card, has ended up being disregarded through history for the last 20 years, and is now available again as a standard AGP graphics card. History doesn't change. So anyway, let's carry on with the rest of the video. That's a very quick refresher on what these were. They are just very boring, but what they do is work. Released in mid-2004, the Nvidia FX5500 is a weird graphics card for a few reasons, because despite having a much fancier name over the FX5200, it is more or less the exact same card. The only thing it does have is an increased memory bus, which is now a standard 128-bit across the range. They did still sell some that were 64-bit to add to the confusion, but we're going to ignore that for now. And it now got a choice of 128 megabytes or 256 megabytes of DDR memory. Other than that, the rest is the same. You get 4 pixel shaders, 4 ROPs, and 4 TMUs. DirectX 9 support is technically there, but in the same vein as the rest of the FX series, it doesn't work very well. Our card, being a China variant, actually even comes with the same clocks as the FX5200, meaning even like a few releases from the day, this is actually just a low-end card wearing a fancy name badge. However, for the money that they sell, it's one of the cheapest AGP cards on the market, and you are getting a technically refurbished card with new capacitors and all that on a fresh PCB, and for the price, the specs aren't as bad as some of the no-name alternatives. Now I've gone through and updated the benchmark suite a little bit, with some fresh challenges for the FX5500, which includes titles older than the card and some fresh titles newer than the card, which may actually seem a little bit surprising. Generally, I'm not going into these benchmarks expecting much. We tested the FX5200 on the channel, and we didn't even test a version of the card that was all too great. In fact, the specs of that card are very, very close to what we've got on test today. So that adds to the confusion of the entire series, because now in 2025, you've got more variants of this card to worry about with these fresh releases from China. So with all that out of the way, why don't we find out if this card is a bit of an AGP saviour or still the same sour turd it was back in the day, with the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have Morrowind, which ran somewhat okay. I mean, the performance isn't exactly stellar, but we were able to enable things like shader effects and shadows, but it did mean our render distance was set down quite low, as otherwise towns and cities became more or less unplayable. The image quality was actually surprisingly decent, and it's worth noting that all of the benchmarks you're going to see have been captured over VGA, so you're seeing a straight-through analog signal here. And that's because one thing this card can do is crystal clear analog output, so we are going to give it points for that. When you're actually out in the wilderness though playing Morrowind, you could see well over 60 FPS, but performance on the card was so sporadic that you couldn't get away with settings much higher than this if you didn't want the FPS to drop right down when anything intensive was going on. Next up with Far Cry 1, which started off running so awfully in DirectX mode that I switched it back over to OpenGL, which you can at least do via the CFG file. The only thing is here, performance wasn't great compared to what I was expecting, because I went back and compared against my old FX5500 video, where this card now is achieving half the frame rate of its predecessor. Maybe it's the system differences or something like that. We're not running a Pentium 4 here, but really that is a downside for the last time we tested this. So it just seems like the FX5500 doesn't get on too well with Far Cry, because DirectX was unplayable, and OpenGL, sure, it looks okay and runs about okay, but there's definitely something not quite right here. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic was a bit of a surprise, because it did actually run alright. I never went into this expecting great performance, but it was surprisingly okay in places. Not exactly spectacular, but enough to actually enjoy the game with lower settings in 480p. Image quality once again though meant that the resolution wasn't too much of a problem, but once again, because this is an FX5500, any settings higher than this or resolutions higher than this, and in true Nvidia FX fashion, things will start to go downhill very, very quickly. Generally though, it was quite playable with these settings, and you'd see anywhere from 20 through to 40 FPS most of the time. As a real test of the image quality, I ran Half-Life 1, but you're probably seeing that 30 FPS figure and weeping, and that is fair enough. But this is the game running with every driver-side enhancement turned on. We're talking 8x anti-aliasing, as much texture filtering as possible. I was enabling settings that I hadn't even heard of, and the end result was that the game looked brilliant. Genuinely, this is over VGA onto an LCD display, and I rarely get to see Half-Life 1 look this sharp. It's just a shame that it can only muster 30 FPS, which is a number it did stick to almost religiously. Still, take this as more of a test of what the card can do, rather than what you should probably do on it, because you get spectacular image quality with those settings. You're just going to have to tweak them around to balance that out with the performance the card can actually offer. Unreal Tournament 2003 ran just about as well as expected, which means to say that it ran fairly well. I mean, 1024x768 did require us to use lower settings, but we still maintained a really rather good frame rate. You could lower the resolution and increase some of the eye candy, but really that is up to the preference of how you like playing the game. I just wanted to see if we could get some higher resolution gaming out of the card, given its 128-bit memory bus. So it runs okay. I mean, for its era, given that this game is older than the card, that's not exactly great performance, but in the context of today, well, it's not too bad for the money you spend. Half-Life 2 did require us to drop things back to 640x480 in order to keep some of the graphics settings turned up, and even then we were capable of seeing well in excess of 100 FPS some of the time. The issue is with how sporadic the performance is on a card like this, where one moment you're seeing 80 FPS and the next moment it can actually be down to single digits if your settings are up too high. So this was the smoothest we managed to get the game to look and run, and that was with these settings here. In true FX fashion again, it does lock the game to DirectX 8, which does look fairly good, but makes you realise that these really aren't DirectX 9 compliant cards. It doesn't matter what you were doing though, you would see really rather good performance as you went through the game, and it didn't even look too rough either. Mysteriously enough though, Fable: The Lost Chapters was now surprisingly playable, which for a card that is more or less an FX5200 in a suit, did actually surprise me, as back when we last tested the game on this card, we were struggling to break into the teens with even lower settings though. So, surprisingly, being able to run the game in 800x600, still with low settings, things were not just playable, but they were smooth. That isn't to say this is an amazing experience at all. I mean, far from it. You're better off buying any ATI card from this era, and it'll look and run far nicer. But it's still good to see that Fable does indeed work perfectly fine here.
Finally though, and this one was a bit of a cruel test, I decided to see if we could make Minecraft run on the system, given that for all the FX series flaws, I've always found they deal with OpenGL rather well. So take this one as a bit of a test of how it handles it. I mean, it's not a very reliable test, but it is a fun one, as we were able to run the Tekkit Classic mod pack with the lowest of settings, all set in Optifine. We're talking no animations, anything like that, a minimal render distance, and we were mostly ended up hanging around 30 FPS, which did have the odd amount of hitching as the world loaded in, but this isn't a particularly fair test on the graphics card, but it's one where it did at least run, and we were able to actually finish on a bit more of an optimistic note, which is that Minecraft will work and is playable and does actually suit the crystal clear 640x480 output on the weird AliExpress 5500. So, rather impressive, bit weird, but it will run. Overall performance then? Well, it's weird, because in true Nvidia FX fashion, it doesn't really make sense. See, it wasn't until after I'd done the benchmarks that I went back and actually looked at my old FX5500 video, where we mostly talking about history. But it had a decent way for me to actually compare to this card here, because they are so identical. And it just made me more and more confused. Because something like Far Cry, for example, ran much, much worse here. We even resorted to using OpenGL to make it actually do something. But Fable not only ran at double the frame rate of the FX5200, it was in a higher resolution as well. And then you had titles like Unreal 2003, where they were seeing the exact same frame rate, in the exact same scenes, at the exact same points. Now, I know these comparisons aren't like for like, but it just goes to show, you're going to have to treat the performance of these AliExpress AGP cards as you see them here. In some games they might do better, in others they might be woefully worse, and it just comes down to a number of reasons. I mean, I don't know the exact reason it could be. I mean, even the PC we're testing this in is getting confused at certain points. GPU-Z says we're using AGP mode, the Nvidia drivers say we're using PCI, and performance across the board doesn't exactly give us a definitive verdict, because I'm not used to seeing a PCI version of a card handle these resolutions or these games, at least Fable, this well. It shouldn't happen, because it's outperforming the AGP card, and then in some it's doing worse. So I'd say the main takeaway from this performance is, it runs games, it works. And that point there, it works. When we're talking about the world of AGP, that is actually a selling point now. The fact that you can buy these, plug them in, and they work without artifacting is a selling point. In a lot of ways, there is very little else to say and a lot more to say about these cards. It just depends on how in-depth you want to go. The image quality over VGA is brilliant. It's ludicrously sharp. Even when you scale things down, you are fine to use whatever you want for a display here. CRT or LCD, it's going to look great, which is a huge selling point. And the drivers are full of features that do actually work, if you can find a game that will survive the performance hit, that is. Because it can be rather intensive on this card. It decides what features are and aren't actually something it wants to run. The cooler, for example, rather nice. It doesn't make any noise and the card doesn't get hot. And at least you don't have to worry about pushing fresh capacitors on this thing, because these are old salvage chips grafted onto a new PCB. I mean, I left the card running a stress test for quite a while to see if it'd run into any stability problems or crashes, and even after a good few hours, I went out to check on it, and it runs just fine. So it depends. You could really go in depth with this video, but I think that's a good note to leave it on. It's weird, but it does a few things really well, and for a card that you can just go out and buy, that's not a bad takeaway. So there we have it, the FX5500, and it's been a bit of an interesting video because on paper it's not great, but when you actually come to use it in today, well, its main competitor is something like this, the 3D Phantom, where you can grab these on eBay for the same price you can grab this from AliExpress. And I'd certainly much rather have the Nvidia FX chip, which is not something anyone would ever be saying, but it's a good little retro graphics card for basic pre-DirectX 9 titles. I mean, when you run anything more modern, I mean, you are looking at sort of 20 FPS, but it's quiet. The image quality is amazing. I mean, this is running over VGA. It looks great. The actual output quality is fine. It's just, you're not getting a very good graphics card. You're getting something that's very passable for 90s titles, it's just about okay for 2000s titles, but for anything, the moment it's after its release, you're looking at low settings, and that's if it'll even work. Anything post 2004, becomes very questionable on these cards, because at the end of the day, it's a rebranded low-end chip that's been rebranded again 20 years later and then is being sold made out of recycled parts. I mean, I love the ingenuity of it and I love the availability of it. If you just want an AGP graphics card, you will probably struggle to find one that is as available and as good as this, because they simply don't exist anymore and they're getting rarer. So I hope you all enjoyed watching. You know, at the end of the day, it's a funky little chip of a graphics card that no one wanted when it came out, and maybe it's finally found its purpose. And that purpose is, there are so many of them, they can still sell them today. So I hope you've all enjoyed watching, and I hope this has all been entertaining for you. Thank you very much, and good night. Just letting people know that channel memberships are now actually live, and with some of the tiers you actually get extra videos, so look out for that. And if you want to see a Windows Vista Dell XPS laptop being resurrected, there should be a video on that going out quite soon for channel members.